All right, today we are back to work on the C6 competition drift car build. We are closing in on the home stretch. We've got not too much more to go, and that's what we're gonna start tackling. Now, it may look further apart than it is, and that's because if you didn't see the last episode, we sent the entire turbo hot side and exhaust system out to get a header shielding service done, which will drastically reduce our underhood temperatures and the surface temperature of all the hot stuff, which will help a lot. Heat management is going to be our biggest enemy with this car, so it's something we absolutely needed to do, and we were able to get the stuff sent out. We should have it back in time, and in the meantime, we just need to knock out as many projects as we can, so hopefully by the time we get it back, we can throw it on and we're ready to party. So, that being said, we've got a decent bit to do, but where we're starting today is wiring. Where we need to start is we've got our bulkheads up here. So this one is gonna be for the chassis side of things, the headlights, auxiliary sensors, stuff like that, and this one is going to be dedicated to just everything that is attached to the engine. So that way, if we want to pull the engine out, pull this connector, everything stays with the engine. That'll be really handy for serviceability. So we have one more bulkhead that's going to go back here that we haven't placed yet, but we know roughly where it's going to be. We need to start splitting off our leads for our harness to where they need to go, and start pinning them into each connector, because basically everything that's coming out of here is going to go through one of these three connectors. So the interior chassis harness will be completely disconnectable from the back, which will be disconnectable from the front. So we'll have essentially three harnesses: front, middle, rear. Let's quit the jibber. Let's get to work. All right, guys, before we get too deep into today's video, I wanted to talk to you about today's video sponsor, Athletic Greens. So AG1 by Athletic Greens is a nutritional drink that contains over 75 different ingredients: vitamins, minerals, probiotics, adaptogens, all of this good stuff that your body needs and craves. And I can tell you your body craves it, especially if you're not getting it like I wasn't. So I started using AG1 quite a while ago now, and it has been immensely helpful. It's simplified my health routine. It's so easy to do. It's so easy to keep up with. It's not like some other stuff you try and it's just too much effort to keep track of. I mean, it's a piece of cake, right? One scoop, 8 to 12 ounces of cold water. I err on the taller side, so it lasts me a little bit. I like sipping on it. And that's it, you're done. Drink it in the morning, I'm good to go for the day. I've got all my vitamins, I've got all my minerals, and I've got a lot more energy. You know, I've cut way back on coffee. I'm really tired of drinking coffee all the time, and this is giving me the energy I need, but with the mental clarity and focus I want. And not only that, but I'm getting vitamins and minerals at the same time. Like, couldn't really ask for much more. So I personally really like the taste. They did a really good job to make something so healthy taste as good as it does. I've really enjoyed it. It's definitely helped me a lot mentally, health-wise. It's been an easy routine to stick to. So if you're interested in trying it out for yourself, which I would highly recommend, give it a shot. Go to athleticgreens.com/Taylor Ray with 2 R's. And Athletic Greens is actually going to give you guys a free 1-year supply of immune-supporting vitamin D, as well as 5 free travel packs with your first purchase. So huge shout out to Athletic Greens for sponsoring this video. But it's time for us to get back to work. We got a lot to do. Not a lot of time to do it. All right, well, we've got our harness roughed out. We've got everything split up, essentially front and rear. So this is all the stuff that's going to the rear, either grounds or going through the bulkhead back there to all that stuff. This is all the stuff that's gonna go to the front, either up to the ECU or through the bulkhead and out front to all the stuff up there. Now, we need to add a couple of wires. I did a little test just to make sure that these pins I got were the right ones for these connectors, which they are. So I just pinned this wire in here just to see, make sure we're good there. So we have the pins, but I need to order quite a few things. I need to order some heat shrink sleeving, I need to order wire, and I'm just kind of gone down the rabbit hole a little bit. I was going to do this harness basic and just run grommets through the firewall, then I decided to bulkhead it, and then now I'm over here wanting to get like nice proper mil-spec wire, especially for this heavy gauge stuff in the rear, so I've got to wait to get that stuff in. But we have another big project to do in the wiring department, and that is our ECU wiring. So we have an off-the-shelf Holley harness here, and what we're going to try to do is two things. One, we're going to have to cut it and splice it, pin it to our firewall connector. The other thing I want to do is I want to try to clean up the wrap and just wrap it a little nicer with some, ideally heat shrink tube, but that would require us depinning all of these connectors, which I don't know that I'm in the mood to do all that, or at least some fireproof loom. So basically, I need to get this kind of de-loomed, at least this first half of it, and see what we're working with. All right, well, we've got this thing condensed down where we need it. We've kind of tucked all the things back that we don't need. So we're all good there. We can clean this stuff up later. My main thing was just getting down to the bare essentials. What do we absolutely need to all go through this connector and be on the engine harness? Now, there's a couple things we could ditch here, but luckily we have just enough pins to do it as is without having to kind of reroute anything. This works out perfect. So now we just got to commit. We just got to cut this big bundle of wires and start pinning it into our connector. The connector kit we got comes with a pinout, so we can write down each color so that we know when we go to build the other side of it where everything goes. So yeah, enough jibber jabber. Let's cut this thing. Definitely the point of no return here. Gotta try to cut as much as we can at one time. So with the point of no return passed, it was time to just get our head down and get to work. This is going to be a long and tedious process. Now, luckily, these proper Deutsch solid contacts, while they require a much more expensive crimper, they are much, much easier to deal with. You just slide it in, you set the tool on basically your wire size and how deep the connector needs to go. You have basically a backstop. Slide the wire in, boom, one ratchet, and you're done. It has no multiple steps to it. It's literally pretty much as easy as it can be. So the process goes pretty quick, but it's still time consuming to strip all of these wires, and it's important that we get the strip length right. If we strip it too long, we're not only going to have parts of the wire exposed outside of the contact, but it's going to make it harder to install the pins because now it's not going to be as stiff as it needs to be to shove it into the connector and through all the seals. So getting the strip length right is pretty crucial. So that really is kind of what took the most time because you're not going to get it 100% accurate on all of them. So having to go back and trim a little or strip a little bit more because obviously you want it to go full depth in there so you have the best contact possible, time consuming. But it's one of those things, it'll pay off in the end. So we get all of our pins crimped, and we're gonna need to pin this in the car because we can't pass either end through the hole. So I wanted to go ahead and loom it up first before we put it back in. It's just gonna be much easier to do it here on the bench. So I like to use this stuff called Tessa tape. It's cloth tape. Now, some of you might say this is jank, and that's unacceptable. I love when people say that one. It's unacceptable. But if you didn't know, this is actually what the factory interior wiring harness was loomed with. The factory harness that we pulled out of this car was loomed in the exact same Tessa tape. So if the manufacturer is good with it, I think we can be good with it. So I like the Tessa tape. It works really well because it keeps everything as compact as possible. You're not dealing with loom that's thicker and has to double wrap around. It keeps everything super tight and bunched together and makes everything a lot stiffer and hold shape better. I really enjoy using Tessa tape. So we wrapped it in Tessa tape, we shoved it through the hole, and now it's time to pin it. Now this is going to be the part where we've really got to keep our wits about us. We cannot make any mistakes here. We've got to document this all the way through, and we've really got to kind of plan where everything needs to go. So the wideband bunch I did first because it was going to be the hardest to pin because they're all coming out of a shielded sleeve. So they're all pretty close together and they don't have a lot of slack. So we can't just pin them, you know, every so often. We've got to kind of pin them all at the same time. Otherwise, they're just going to get bunched up and be very difficult to work with. So once those are pinned, we can start pinning everything else. And pinning these is a little tricky because you're basically relying on the wire's stiffness to shove it through. It's got a long path to travel. It's got to go through the seal first, then into the pocket essentially with the end of it, and then it's got to go past the lock and snap in. So it was definitely tricky. The stiffer the wire, the easier this process is. But if the wire is a little bit soft, it gets tough. So that's what the needle nose are for, to either pull the wire through that last little bit to lock it in or push it through from the backside. But you got to be careful because if you put too much force on pushing it in the backside and then it gets bent, then it doesn't want to go in even more and it fights you even harder. So one of those things. But we're just going through, pinning each one individually, writing every single one down, what pin it is, what the wire color is, what the strip color is. And after a little while, we get it done. And it's all pinned, the connector's done, so now we can reinstall it, put our backing plate back on, and see what the finished product looks like. All right, that one side of the connector is all finished up, fully pinned, bolted back in. You can see our harness there. I'm not going to heat shrink the boot until I know we're done and everything works. But we've got our aux harnesses here. We're not really going to need these because we're probably going to run them off an independent connector since the Dominator has so many. But yeah, so got a relay here. For now, we're going to run the relay. I'd like to run this through the PDM. I might change my mind on that, but I might just leave it as it is for now to keep things simple. Now, obviously, the harness is a little longer than I'd want it to be. I would have made it a good bit shorter, but we needed to keep these on the inside because we didn't have enough pins to run these through to the other side, and we don't really need them to go through the other side anyway. We're going to need them to go through that connector, if anything. So, glad to have that done. Very happy about that. So we're going to start on this side. This side should be a lot easier because we can just do it all on the bench. And we have our roadmap completely filled out. I even went through and made sure that I labeled what each thing is. So we have pin, color, and then what it is, and mostly the pins on the ECU connectors as well. So if we ever need to diagnose something, we'll have all the info. So this connector was a fair bit easier. One, we had just done the process, so we knew pretty much everything we needed to do. We knew what pins were going to go where, what wires needed to go here and there, and which ones stayed together, and how far to strip the shielding sleeve for the wideband and the crank sensors. So it's one of those things. Second time you do something in a row, it always goes a good bit quicker. But same process as before, same, just as tedious as before, just one pin at a time, 47 pins, man. It's a lot. It doesn't sound like a lot until you start doing it and you watch the pin pile just slowly diminishing. It takes a while, but luckily, like I said, these are really easy to pin, really easy to crimp. It's about as easy as it gets for crimping any sort of contact onto wires. So we just go to town crimping these up. We got to make sure that we get them right. We basically have one heavy gauge pin that needs to go on a not as heavy gauge wire, so we don't want to make a mistake and put that one on the wrong one because it's got to go on the right one because that's what it is on the other side. So just a little bit of thought, but again, it's pretty straightforward, no big deal. So we get them all crimped. In the meantime, I had to help Josue go ahead and cut this AN line, so he's working on some of the plumbing while I'm working on this. So I got the line cut for him and then got back to my task at hand, which is pinning out this connector. Now this one was significantly easier because we weren't hunched over leaning into the car. We're doing it on the bench, but we did fight with one wire. There was just one wire that just did not want to go in. No matter what, it didn't want to go in. And the more you fight with it, the harder it gets because, as I mentioned earlier, it kind of bends and bunches up, and then it's less uniform and it's less stiff, so it wants to go in even less. And I mean, once you start fighting with one, man, it can be an absolute struggle, and it's tough, man. But luckily, I found this other tool that I had. I got it a long time ago, thinking I would use it, and then I hadn't really used it, and it turned out to be a lifesaver for this and made the rest of this whole process easy. So even though we have all the pin out, we know where everything needs to go, it's still very tedious and time consuming because the way connector pinouts work, they work from a certain direction. So the back side of one connector matches the front side of the other. So it's just tricky. You've got to make sure that you pay attention to which side's which and which side the numbers are on and which side the diagram is following. Otherwise, you're going to get your wires crossed and put some pins in the wrong place. All right, well, we got the harness side of the connector done up. So it definitely took a little longer than I expected, even having the pin out and just having to plug each wire in. I mean, it is 47 wires, and you have to be pretty methodical and really think through which ones you want to pin when. Could kind of work from the inside out, just so you don't have some in the middle that you got to get to later. But overall, pretty happy with how it came out. We got our 90 built into it, so I'm happy with that. These little things, I bought these a long time ago. These are kind of like what they use in the medical field, and I've never used them. Never really had found something to use them for. I just thought they'd be nifty, and they worked out really well for shoving these wires into the connector. That's really the trickiest part of this. It's just you're relying on the stiffness of the wire to punch through and get into that pin. So the softer the wire, the harder it is. Luckily, this is all proper automotive grade wire. But this is why you don't want to buy cheap wire like this. You know, I'm all about point of diminishing return, cost per value, but like this kind of wire where it's just like a ball of goo, it's just not stiff at all. This is not what you want for an automotive application. I could not get that wire to pin into this connector if I had used it. Absolutely no chance. So anyway, I'm jibber jabbering. What we need to do next, I want to reloom this. I want to reloom this whole thing. But before we do that, I want to check our work. So what we're going to do is we're going to plug this in to our connector here, and we're going to verify continuity from the pin at the ECU all the way to whatever it's going to, and make sure that the wire that we have here goes all the way to its destination with no issues. We have good continuity. We don't have our wires crossed anywhere. The last thing we want to do is go to start this thing and be having troubles and pops and bangs, and it turns out we've got a pair of injectors flipped or some silly issue, and then we have to dive into that. Or we dive into that thinking that's maybe it and it's some other issue and we're chasing our tail. We don't want to do that. So I want to verify this now. That way if we need to make any changes, we can do it before we start taping this thing up. So yeah, enough jibber jabber. Let's plug this thing in and moment of truth, see if we got it right. So basically what we're going to do here is check for continuity from the plug at the ECU to the end of whatever that wire is. Wherever it goes, the plug that's going to plug into whatever it needs to plug into. So that is going to let us verify, one, that all the wires are in the right places, they are pinned correctly on both sides of the connector, and two, that there's no broken part of the connection anywhere. So to do this, basically we set the multimeter for continuity. Now the simple setting for this is it just makes a beep. So basically if you touch the two probes together, the black probe and the red probe, it'll beep, and that tells you that they're making a connection. They have continuity. So we put one probe in at the ECU, the very start of the wires run. Then we take the other probe and put it in at whatever the end of the connector it terminates at. And if we get a beep, that means we have connection to both of those probes. And we have that connection through the wire coming from the start at the ECU all the way to the end. So we're verifying A, that the pin on the ECU is going to the right pin or connector on the other end, and again, B, that they have good connection, good continuity, low resistance, all the way through from start to finish. So that verifies that it's all correct. All right, well, our harness is good. We checked from the ECU connector all the way to every respective pin at the end of the harness. Checked every single one, all of them. All of them were well. We were all good, which is great. That means we got the pins all seated well, got good continuity between them. We got everything right. We don't have any wires crossed from front to back. Really, really happy about that. I'm glad we took the extra time to check it. That way we know for sure that all of it is well and where it's supposed to be. So now it's time to split this harness down to its bones and re-loom it. So we're gonna use the cloth tape like we did on the inside. I really like this stuff. It just creates pretty much the tightest packaging and stiffens everything up and makes it easier to kind of hold its shape. But we are also going to use some split loom in certain places. So we have this Nomex split loom from Holley, and I really like this stuff. I used it on the Safiro's engine harness, and it saved the majority of the harness when that car caught on fire when the engine threw a rod out the block. So it definitely was worth having. So we're going to try to use it, you know, in certain places on this harness. But first we need to get it stripped down. So I'm going to tape up this little bit, and then we'll strip the rest of it, see what we're working with. All right, we've got our harness stripped down to the bones. So we got all our sensors pulled out. So our fuel pressure sensor is routed all the way here. So we've pulled that back over here, along with our oil pressure sensor and then our map sensor. Since all three of these are actually gonna be going to the same location, the rice sensor block. Now in hindsight, I should have not pinned them through the firewall there, made a second connector here, and then pinned them through the firewall on my chassis side. Same difference really, connector on the inside versus outside, but basically we'll just have to unplug this one connector when we pull this connector to leave all this with the engine, which no big deal. It's one more connector, not a big deal. But it just would have been a little cleaner to do it on the inside, but then we'd have that extra connector if we pulled the harness over there. So again, same difference. Just knowing what I know now, it's probably the way I would have done it instead. But this was simpler to keep all the engine stuff together and keep the main engine harness complete and not start splitting out of it down here. So that being said, what we need to do now, what I'm going to do now is go ahead and tape up the bulk of the harness that's already situated. Then I've got a 5 volt in the ground here and an extra 5 volt in the ground here. This is what you need to power a lot of sensors. So what we're going to do is pin these out on each end into a 2-pin connector, just terminate them, boom, and then that way, if we want to add any sensors later on, we'll have them on either side, essentially here or back there. So that'll just be nice to have it, so we won't have to go splicing in or repinning stuff to add another sensor if we wanted to. So yeah, anyway, I'm gonna start taping this thing up. Well, with the harness complete, the final shape done and dusted, we could finally do the satisfying part of taping it all up. As I've said a few times now, I really like using this cloth tape because it just makes everything so thin and tidy. I mean, it's as thin as the wires plus the thickness of the tape. It's very rewarding when you wrap something like this. It just makes it look so nice. And it's not the most complete product, being that it's just tape, but it does have really good abrasion resistance and it works really well to keep everything nice and tidy. So I went ahead and taped up pretty much everything aside from the crank and knock sensors, since those are sleeved with basically a heat loom, because they're going to go by the exhaust no matter what. And then I went ahead and started putting our fire loom on. So I made the mistake with the Zafiro and I got way too big of a loom. And pretty much everywhere I put the loom, the split loom was much bigger than it needed to be. And that's one of the things I didn't like about this harness and that made me want to re-loom it, is the loom was all pretty big. So it just didn't fit that snugly. You'd have 2-3 wires, but you know, a 3/8 half-inch thick bundle. So I'd used the smallest loom possible on everything we could and just loomed everything up to try to keep it as tight and tidy as possible. So with that done, we had our off-the-shelf coil pack harnesses. I just wanted to go ahead and do the same thing to them. So these I didn't fire loom because they're kind of out of harm's way. I just cloth taped them and it keeps them nice and thin and compact to kind of hide under the coils there. All right, well, there we go. Completed engine harness. Got a little carried away with the fire loom. I was gonna do just a couple spots, but then I ended up doing all of it. But it looks good. It's crazy how much it's trimmed down, remote mounting the sensors and such. So it's all done, it's ready to go on, aside from the boot. But I don't wanna shrink the boot yet because it's an angled boot. I wanna make sure I know kind of where this thing angles once it's all in place before I do that. So let's install our coil pack harnesses and our engine harness real quick, at least most of the way. See what we're working with. So I knew getting this harness in was going to be a challenge. There is just not a lot of room behind the engine to route a wiring harness. So I went ahead and threw the coil pack harnesses on first, which they actually turned out really nice. I was really happy with them with the cloth tape. It kept them real thin. You can barely tell they're there with where these coil packs are mounted, which is always the goal, even on a race car. You want the wiring to look tight. It's just satisfying. So anyway, we get it in roughly enough to know which direction the boot's gonna go. So we pull it back out, heat shrink the boot. Now, normally you would epoxy the boot to fully seal it up, but because of the type of loom we're using and because I plan on rebuilding this harness at some point, you know, during the off season, I decided not to epoxy it, just that way it'll be easier to take apart in not too much time, right? This is kind of a temporary deal for us. So with that done, it's time to actually put the harness in. So we did have to pull the intake off. It is really tight on a Vette behind the intake. That is one of its weak points. There's not a lot of room to the wiper cowls. So we had to pull it off and try just a few different routing locations, going under the intake or going around the intake. And we ended up having to go under, one for aesthetics, but two, to get to the other side of the throttle body since we have it flipped. There's some challenges, but it's in and it fits. All right, engine harness is in and more or less complete, right? So curves here, goes up there. The only thing we're missing is our injector harness, which we'll plug in right there. So that's one thing less, you know, one more thing that'll be in here. But overall, it looks really clean, as clean as I had hoped. You know, these route under nice and clean. Once the intake's in here, you'll barely be able to see them. This will go to the intake for our intake air temp sensor. And our cam sensor routing down here, coolant temp sensor. I have the wideband routing up here. I'm not sure how we'll do that. We got to decide on that. That's just definitely the safest way to keep it away from the exhaust. The only thing we weren't able to plug in is our coil pack harness plug is there, and the other end of it is here. So we're gonna have to do something there, either modify, rebuild this harness to put it kind of center and connect to it, you know, down under here, or get an extension or something. We'll have to figure something out there. But otherwise, it all went back together nicely. Very, very pleased with that. Definitely a lot of work just to essentially cut a harness in half and repin it and re-loom it, but I'm happy with it. It's done, it's got a nice route. Boom. So not only did we get that done, but we actually got some more line stuff done. So Josue got this line in, so down to the breather tank for the dry sump tank. That panned out really nice with those dual ORB 90s because we need some room down here left. We're gonna run some ventilation. So that line's done. We got one of the coolant lines done for inside. So coming through there, boom. And up to there, we've got it heat sleeved to be up to the rules of clutch kickers and FD. So he started working on the second line. However, unfortunately, had a little mishap with some braid getting caught in the threads, and it ate up the threads on the collet. So I've got to get another fitting. And really, I need to get maybe a couple more and a little more line. I may have undershot it on how much line we needed. So we'll have to revisit that, but we've got that line. And then he's got the pass-through in here, so we'll come out of these. Boom, to the radiator, and then all of the big lines are done and dusted. So we're getting there, man. We're cruising along. Got a good bit of wiring done, a good bit of plumbing done. Tedious stuff, but this is the odds and ends that can sometimes take forever. So we're gonna try to keep trucking on it, but for now, we are out of time. Been working on this thing way longer than I'd like to admit. So I'm gonna go ahead and end it here. Thanks for watching. Thanks for subscribing. I will see you next time, hopefully, right? Okay, goodbye.